All right, everybody, welcome back. I will pick up now for the second part. And again, welcome to all that are here for this special panel session advocating for scientific study of unidentified aerial phenomenon, technical perspective with focus on aviation safety. Now we come to our second half of speakers, which will be emphasizing and discussing safety implications of the UAP. So it is my pleasure to introduce Ryan Graves, who's a lieutenant in the United States Navy, who served for over 10 years, specifically also as a naval aviator, FA-18, F as in Foxtrot pilot. Right now, he's currently a principal investigator within research and development in the aerospace defense industry. And with that, let me turn it over to you, Ryan, and look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. This is great to be here in front of you and be able to have this conversation in front of the people that I know, at least from the industry and my experience as an operator, are the ones that are going to be able to introduce technology that's going to be able to help us out. So just to kick things off here, you know, we have the most respect for the scientists and engineers that make some of the technology that we have the privilege to use. So it's an honor for me to speak to you all here, and this is certainly going to be a highlight. So thank you for being here. The title of my talk is Persistent Detection of Non-Participating Aircraft by United States Navy Tactical Aircraft. And you will notice the date 2014 to the present. Next slide, please. So for those that do not have a background, as stated, I was a FA-18 Foxtrot pilot attached to VFA-11, the Red Rippers. We were stationed in NAS Oceana. It's the Master East Coast Jet Base located in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Now, as a Navy pilot, we are training when we're in the United States. So we're not in an operational status. We don't necessarily carry weapons. What we are doing is going through our training so that when we deploy, we can act as an expeditionary force. But to prepare for those deployments, we operate in a number of working areas, one of those being off the coast of Virginia Beach, starting about 10 nautical miles off the coast, where it is not a restricted area, but it is an area where we will maintain MARSA, which is when the military assumes responsibility for separation of aircraft. So we typically are in communication with everyone that is out there, and we do have some assistance from controllers to give us a heads up if anyone is out there transiting that shouldn't be. One very important consideration is during this time period, we were one of the few squadrons that had the aircraft plumbed in order to upgrade our primary sensor, the APG-73. We were upgrading it to the APG-79, which was really a big change for us to go from the mechanically scanned array to the active, to the AESA radar. So a lot of capability. And for some of us, it wasn't our first time flying this aircraft. Utilizing this radar, as we had used it during our training. But when we got to the fleet squadron, we were strictly an APG-73 squadron until this point. Additionally, we would often fly with the ANASQ-228 Advanced Targeting Forward-Looking Infrared Pod, which I will forevermore refer to as the FLIR. That is kind of our eyeball where we can receive the standard camera vision or IR energy, depending on the mode we're selected in. And really how this story starts is that we start upgrading the radar while we're flying in the area, and essentially we start picking up more things than we're used to. Next slide, please. All right, so once we started flying onto the areas, we started noticing some radar contacts that were in the confines of our working areas that did not appear to be respecting any of the area subdivision boundaries or even the primary boundaries outside of the airspace. They didn't seem to be playing by the same rules as us. A lot of them were stationary. Some of them were flying in some patterns that we'll discuss here later. And we're really seeing them wherever we were looking. So really from 35,000 feet down the surface, which is kind of our standard scan where I would typically look. So, you know, this is the airspace that we're typically operating in, and wherever we look, we were seeing them essentially. As I said, there's really two categories is how we surmise this, is that there's stationary ones. So, and that was indicated by relative velocity to the surface of the Earth, and then non-station ones that were moving around out there. As we were exclusively operating off of the East Coast and over the water, we did notice them over the water, so a bit of a selection bias, but, you know, turning back to the west or when operating over the land, you know, our radar is out in front of us, and we did not see them over land at this point. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the stationary objects were a bit peculiar in appearance on our sensors. So always 0.0 Mach, as defined again, stationary over a ground point, regardless of winds. So remaining stationary against the winds in a very stable manner. Target aspect indicative of perhaps the computer didn't know how to read it, or perhaps rotation. So the blue circle with the line coming out of it represents what I would see on my system, and the straight line represents the target aspect of the contact. So where are they going? While this particular drawing down here shows a progression through 3 stages, that's what we see. We basically see a stationary object where the target aspect would, in a somewhat consistent manner, kind of rotate around the contact. So it kind of was almost as if it was kind of just banging around up there, or there was some uncertainty with the reading. So in that way, at least I was able to kind of look out and be like, oh, that's one of those particular things out there. And it was a way of identifying them and separating it from potentially other air contacts out there. Most air contacts have very smooth target aspect, and it's very clear, as you would expect. Next slide, please. The non-stationary behaviors really are mostly defined by the speed. So I would typically see them somewhere in the vicinity of 0.6 Mach to 0.8 Mach. And they would be proceeding either in a straight line east. I would see them in a racetrack pattern. And occasionally I'd see them just coming down, usually not aggressively fast, just coming down 1,000 to 4,000 feet. It is a very rough estimate. It didn't appear to me as if it was drifting down, I would say, but it was moving down with a decent velocity. On the rare occasions, you know, we'd look out, or at least I would look out, and I would see them in the supersonic range, 1.1 to 1.2 Mach. Those were kind of the ones that I would typically see just kind of cruising east. They wouldn't be in a holding pattern at that airspeed when I did observe those. And one thing that's kind of peculiar here is that, you know, I very rarely would see them accelerate, you know, so I would very rarely see a stationary one that would be stationary, and while I watched it, it would just accelerate to 0.6 or whatever airspeed, 1.1. Very rarely see that, right? And it's an important thing to remember here that we're not out there looking for these things in particular, right? So we have very complex training missions and objectives that we're looking to accomplish. And so this is kind of a passing consideration. Of course, we'll talk about here shortly why that was a problem, but initially, initially we weren't considering them as a physical object. It was the real reason, but we came to respect them shortly afterwards. Next slide, please. All right, so the fact that they appeared stationary for the most part, and or were kind of moving at airspeeds that we weren't expecting. They weren't expected to be there, right? So for one, we weren't expecting a number of these things to be here anytime, right? It's pretty much F-18s only out there. So to have a non-player out there was strange. But with the radar upgrade, our initial assessment initially was that it was some type of false track that was being provided by the radar. We were not seeing these on the APG-73. We just simply weren't picking them up. However, on the APG-73, you did sometimes get anomalous readings that could represent perhaps some atmospheric conditions that we were familiar with, and we would expect to see a false track or some reflections or some ground clutter or something to that effect. So we were familiar seeing stuff like this. And that was kind of our initial assessment, was that the APG-79, oh, it must have some of those same issues that the 73 had, and perhaps it'll get worked out because we'll get some software upgrades. So at this point, again, it wasn't really a safety concern for us. It was a point of interest about our radar. Next slide, please. Eventually, by chance, aircraft did get within vicinity of the radar contact for the FLIR to be positioned onto that piece of the sky. And they did pick up energy coming from that point. So the FLIR is slave to look at the radar's designation. So at one point they were flying toward one of these objects. They had it on their radar. And as they traversed in the vicinity of it, the FLIR looked at it, stared at it, and they noticed IR energy coming from it. I would notice that. So for what it looked like for me is if there was just energy kind of coming out of that point of the sky, and almost as if someone was shining a flashlight down my sensor. I wasn't seeing, as you see in the image here, the skin of an aircraft. I wasn't seeing exhaust. Even when they're moving, no exhaust. I'm just kind of seeing the fact that it was almost like something was shining at me. IR energy was being reflected at me. So yeah, and they would typically be cold as well on the IR. So I can select white hot, or cold hot, or excuse me, yeah, white hot or cold hot. And we would, excuse me, we'd be able to see that the temperature was relatively colder than the surroundings, which was surprising towards us. So at this point, this really kind of amped it up for us, and we kind of took like a pause for a second and said, hey, there's very likely something physical at these points in the sky here. This is now a big problem because these things were out in our area. People were flying by them and not giving them a second thought. And it's probably more a matter of luck than anything else that we didn't have a midair before we were aware of this. So better lucky than good, we always say. Next slide, please. Once, of course, once the word was out that something was there, of course, some people wanted to take a look. And shortly thereafter, we did end up getting our eyeballs on, but this particular story was purely by chance. There was a flight of 2 F-18 Foxtrots in my squadron with 2 aircrew in each aircraft for a total of 4 aircrew. As they're flying out to the entry point in that area, which is a standard location at its standard altitudes that all aircraft go in or out of the area. One of the objects, it appears, was basically at that entrance point. So as the 2 aircraft were checking into the area, one of these objects basically flew right between the section. The aircraft were probably in the vicinity of about 100 feet apart from each other. So the object was very likely somewhere in the vicinity of 50 feet-ish if it did go directly between them, but it's very difficult to just eyeball gauge size and distances in an aircraft. But when they came back to the ready room, the people that saw it, they were in the ready room with their gear on, which is atypical. It's typically we want to get the sweaty hot stuff off as soon as possible. But was, hey, what's up? And he just had a very surprised look on his face. And he says, hey, those things that we see? Well, I almost hit one of those things. And then he described, he described it as a dark or gray cube inside a clear sphere where the kind of the corners of the cube were touching kind of the surface of that clear sphere. I don't know contextually how you see a clear sphere, so I don't know what that necessarily translates to in reality, right? So there must have been some type of way he visually could make out that sphere. What that means, I don't know. He estimated 50 and 30 feet. Again, very difficult to make estimates, especially when it's a split second near miss like that. We did, of course, have continued visual encounters after that, people going out, taking a look, but it's very difficult to see them. We would have them on the radar, we'd have them on the FLIR, our joint helmet mounted cueing system, which is pumping all this information onto our visor and also tracking your head movements, is showing us exactly where to look for the objects as we're coming to emerge with them. And we do this all the time. We train to this. This is not an abnormal thing to come to emerge with an aircraft for us. So as we come to these merges, this thing that we do all the time, we're highly trained at for dogfighting, it was a hard time seeing them. We couldn't see them. So many of us will go out, we'd zip by, try to slow down. We couldn't see them. Sometimes maybe it would appear like they would descend a little bit, which unfortunately kind of indicates our ability to see them if they just kind of drop below the belly of our aircraft without us flipping over inverted, which I'm sure some did, but we are also making sure we don't hit these things out there. So we are giving them a pretty healthy buffer. So take that for what you will as far as the visual acuity thing, but you know, our box and our sensors are showing us one piece of the sky. So what's the difference between this first, you know, near miss and the second one where it's hard to see them? I don't know, but we can talk about that later. Right now we're kind of getting a little ticked off in the squadron, because for us, our first inclination that this is some type of classified drone program that we're not aware of, and someone is testing it where they should not be, and something needs to be done because we're going to take out an aircraft with possibly 2 souls on it. So that was our primary concern at this point. Next slide, please. Responses midair, we did submit a safety report and then a number of subsequent safety reports, which are now in the public sphere. And I'll let you read this quote from my commanding officer at the time, who's basically acknowledging the fact that no one is probably looking at this information, but this is the only avenue with which we have to report these safety issues. Next slide, please. All right, so fast forward a couple of months here, and we are going out to do our workup cycle for our upcoming deployment aboard the USS Roosevelt. And during that workup cycle, we head down to the Jacksonville coast where we do training for a number of months. Some highlights here: we were aware that there was foreign intelligence gathering operations in our vicinity, which are relatively routine. You know, when we arrived out into the area, the objects were there. So they were either already there when we arrived, or they followed us there, and I don't have any data to support either one of those conclusions. While returning from one of our flights, an air-to-air flight, a relatively large, maybe 8 aircraft, I was in a flight with, I believe it was 3 other aircraft. We went out to conduct our mission. As the missions are ending and people start coming home due to being low on gas, it's typically 1 aircraft at a time. We don't just all come back at the same time. One of the aircraft I was flying with picked up a radar contact and flew over a bit on their way home to investigate. While they, once they landed, they debriefed, showed the tapes I'll talk about here in a second, but the image I captured is what you see on the screen here. I'll let you look at that for a quick moment. Of note, this is the FLIR, and this is in IR mode, not camera. Next slide, please. All right, so what was happening outside of the small clip that folks may have seen already? So on the situational awareness page is kind of where all our data is getting pumped into. And we typically look at that to receive offboard information or even our own onboard information in order to identify targets or all the stuff that we do up there. So what was interesting was that on our situational awareness page, what we noticed was that there was and I use the word formation here, there's a formation of about 4 to 5 aircraft flying in what resembled a wedge formation. And as they were flying along, they began a turn that had some type of radius of turn, right? So it wasn't an instantaneous direction change. It turned as if it was cutting through the air. and they were a bit jumbled, right? So they didn't maintain perfect formation. They kind of scattered out, almost looked semi-random, and they were at separate altitudes as well, but not, so they weren't at the exact same altitude. And as they rolled back out, they basically did a 180 and started flowing in the other direction. The object, the gimbal object from the image before, is represented in this slide by the circle with the line going through it. And this object was proceeding behind the larger group. And essentially it approached and then it stopped for a bit. And then as the formation turned back 180 degrees, it basically it just stopped from that position and then immediately went in the opposite direction, more or less, so that there was really no radius of turn, as I was highlighting on the formation.
2 minutes.
Sorry, Ed?
2 minutes.
Got it. Thank you. What was very interesting here was that the formation, they appeared on the radar similar to the objects we would normally see in Virginia Beach, but the large gimbal object was something we had not seen before. Next slide, please. All right, so this was intended to just be a quick talk about this. I would like to get more into the safety conversation here as we continue forward, but I think it's very important that people understand that this is a very pragmatic thing for me. This is not, I'm not a UFO guy. This is all very new for me. My concern is the fact that we are almost hitting something that's out in our working areas with very expensive aircraft and with people at risk here. The UAP task force report that came out said that in the past 2 years, there were 11 near misses within the data set that they studied. Those are the ones that A, haven't studied, B, that were reported in the past 2 years. So thank you for coming and listening to this. And I appreciate any help that can be had with this safety issue that we were experiencing.
Ryan, thank you so much. I appreciate all your points. So now we go to question and answer for Ryan. Please, people, go ahead.
Hi, Ryan. This is Chris Plain from the Debrief Head Science Writer. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, Chris.
Hi. All right. First of all, thank you for your service. Could you give me a general ratio here? You mentioned a number of radar contacts without visual, and then you mentioned a handful of visual contacts. Would you say we're seeing hundreds or even thousands of radar tracks and we only have a couple of visuals? What sort of ratio in your experience?
Yeah, it's tough, right? So a typical day in the areas, I would typically see, and again, I don't necessarily represent every single person here. So everything I say is my data set or data set I've talked to people about, and there's a lot of other people there. So I would typically see somewhere between like 2 and 5 objects in the working areas, when I was up there. So times that by however many years that's been going on. I have heard maybe people have visually seen it maybe somewhere in the vicinity of 8 to 10 times. And that is me not asking people and people just telling me, so I have no idea what the ratio is, but, obviously we're seeing a lot of them, but that data set is only about 10 visuals. What was very interesting though, when I was deciding to even do any of this and talk to anyone, I was sitting in the ready room with about 10 people and I asked everyone in the room if they remembered those things that were flying around there. And basically everyone that was on the East Coast, there was people on the West Coast too, but the East Coast guys immediately all knew what I was talking about. And one even said, hey, oh yeah, the cube things in the sphere, so I said, okay, we're not crazy here. So, yeah.
Would you say that description of the visual, the cube with the sphere inside, is consistent across the cases where people are reporting physically seeing it?
So far as I've heard, and again, as people have talked about the issue that we've been having on the East Coast, which is, been reported to me happening on the West Coast and possibly further inland as well. But yes, that's as far as I know.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Ryan. This is Peter. I have a question. What you described there as that kind of that gimbal object, and then in front of it was these those things in front were the spheres with the cube inside. And is that right? And then when this gimbal object stopped, and did it instantaneously change direction? I mean, did it stop and then just move, because that would be a huge acceleration if it was moving and it just stopped and then went in another direction.
Yeah. So to answer the first part of your question, yes, to my best assessment, the objects that were in the formation resembled on the radar resembled, the radar contacts I was seeing in Virginia Beach, the Cuban sphere.
So it's like this thing is shepherding these things somehow. These are the parents of it.
I don't have enough information to make that assessment, right? There could be a lot of architectures at play if we're looking at any type of swarm mechanics here. Yeah, and to answer the second part of the question, which was,
well, you said it came to a stop.
Oh yeah, yes.
Changed direction.
Yeah, so I don't know, right? If the line between probably an infinite acceleration, if there's a zero time component at that change in direction, and a very small one is not something I can assess from what I saw.
Well, I mean, not instantaneous, but I mean, very quick. I mean,
the best I can recollect, there was a pause in between the direction change.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I wish I could be more specific, but I don't. My goal is, unless I'm like 100% sure, I'm very timid about
absolutely
making that last 1% connection saying it did happen.
Yeah.
Ryan, hi, it's Philip speaking. I have a question. Thanks for the presentation. During the first presentation of Ravi, and it's a similar question I had, he reported that there's a term in a report called signature management. Does it have a special meaning in terms for the military pilots, and did it apply to the sightings that you just described? What does it mean, signature management? Thank you.
Yeah, that can mean a lot of things. And yes, it is a term that I am very familiar with, and the tactical aviation community is very familiar with. Not to say that the way we use that term is the exact same way that UAP task force uses that term. But, I think everyone immediately goes to, visual signatures, right? So, can you see it? Can you not see it? Is it some kind of cloaking thing? Is it an RF blocker, right? So can you not see it with the radar at all, or can you see it? Is it a something that can detect you're there, but perhaps it's passively detecting you instead of actively detecting you with a radar? That would be some sensor management thing. So it's a big conversation, and unfortunately a lot of it probably goes classified, but I don't know whether my understanding of that term is the same as the UAP task force.
Thanks, Ryan.
Okay, Ryan, I'll have to cut it off here. We can pick up later on the general Q&A. Well, again, thank you very much. Also, I was remiss to mention in Ryan's background to everyone that he also holds a bachelor's and a master's in aerospace engineering. So with that, again, Ryan, thank you, and we'll continue on to our next speaker.
Thank you, Ed. And I just want to correct the record very quick. I actually do not have a master's.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
My mistake.
Good job, Brian.